A family dinner served with a side of lies. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Raymond. Let's hear from you. Share where you're listening in from. You all make this mystery circle feel like home. Now, the tale. If you've ever watched Nero Wolfe spear a leaf of romaine with the kind of deliberation most people reserve for chess tournaments, you know the man doesn't take kindly to interruptions, especially not during lunch, and especially not when the matter involves someone else's misplaced cutlery. It was 1:11 on a Wednesday, and the only sound in the dining room was the steady rhythm of Fritz Brenner's veal cordon bleu, being met with Wolfe's appreciation, expressed in satisfied nasal exhales and the rare murmured compliment. Wolfe doesn't compliment lightly. Neither do I, but even I had to admit the Bechamel had guts. I was midway through my second helping when the doorbell rang. Ignore it, Wolfe said without looking up. He knew the schedule. Mail had been delivered at 11:30, and Inspector Kramer's usual steam train of suspicion didn't roll in until late afternoon, if at all. Whatever this was, it wasn't on the manifest. I glanced toward the hallway. Could be a messenger. Then he can message the sidewalk, Wolfe said, forking a button mushroom. Fritz, the Chardonnay. Fritz moved with his usual dignity, efficient, but never hurried. As he passed, he gave me the kind of look that means don't argue with him. It's your job to deal with the door, not mine. And since Fritz has a hard enough time protecting our plates from Wolfe's caprice and my sarcasm, I stood up, sighed, and headed down the hall. The man waiting on the stoop was slim, tall, and dressed like he had one foot in a boardroom and the other in a gallery opening. His tie was the shade of cranberry juice after an ice cube melts in it, and his hair had that too neat look that comes from either vanity or desperation. "Mr. Goodwin?" he asked, voice clipped, polite, but carrying the slight echo of nerves. "I was told I might find you here." "You found me," I said. "That leaves Mr. Wolfe, who you won't find until after he's done with the fillet and a few thoughts on humanity's failings. You can wait in the front room or make your pitch now, but I won't interrupt him unless your shoes are on fire." He smiled a tight, brittle little thing and stepped inside. I led him to the front room, gave him a look at a chair, and told him he had 10 minutes to make it interesting. "My name is Lionel Boone," he said, sitting carefully. "I manage dining operations for an institution called the Thornfield Circle." I raised a brow. "Sounds like a finishing school for ghosts. It's a private gastronomic society. Select membership. Confidential dinners, rotating chefs, curated menus. We serve no more than 12 guests at a time, and you manage the eats." "The everything," he replied. "But there's been a situation." "There always is. I'm afraid something was planted at one of our recent dinners," Boone continued. "A note, typed, anonymous, folded into a linen napkin. It accused one of our guests, Mr. Redmond Vale, of falsifying legal documents and leveraging them to disinherit a client's widow. Very specific, very damning." Mr. Vale was visibly shaken. "He left before dessert." "Shame," I said. "If the accusation was true, he probably deserved to miss the sofa. If it wasn't, someone sure knows how to sour a béarnaise." Boone leaned forward. "We have rules, no phones, no recordings, no public discussion of who dined or what was served. Privacy is everything. But now someone's using our dinners to settle scores. If this escalates, if the story leaks, we lose everything." He reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. "This is a transcript of the note. I typed it myself, from memory. The original's gone. I didn't touch it yet. Why come to us? I've heard that Mr. Wolfe has a fondness for fine cuisine and a distaste for people who defile rituals, particularly those centered around food. He's also got a distaste for liars, bad grammar, and anyone who slouches. You're taking a gamble." Boone gave a small nod. "I'm hoping the offense to etiquette will compel him." I gave him another slow once-over. He didn't look like a blackmailer or a dramatist, just someone whose control was cracking at the edges. "All right, Boone, go home, or wherever you go when you want to pretend you're not worried. I'll put this in front of the big man." Back in the dining room, I waited until Fritz had cleared the last plate and Wolfe had resumed the battle with gravity in his favorite chair. He had his napkin folded just so and was eyeing a volume of Tacitus like it owed him rent. "I bring tidings," I said, "of betrayal, scandal, and a linen napkin." Wolfe didn't look up. "Phooey. You interrupted digestion for a napkin, not just any napkin. One used to deliver an anonymous accusation at a secret dinner club. For rich men with guilty consciences. That did it." He looked up. "Who was accused?" he asked. "A lawyer named Redmond Vale, of using fake papers to screw a widow. He closed the book. Bah, base opportunism. And the accuser, still anonymous. But the host wants it traced. Name's Lionel Boone. He's afraid the integrity of his little Epicurean temple is cracking." Wolfe tapped his fingers together. "Bring him tomorrow, 11 o'clock. And Archie, see if Saul is available for luncheon." My eyebrows rose. "Saul Panzer? Already? He will not eat. He will observe. A dining room is not merely a place of nourishment, it is a theater of betrayal. We must begin where the curtain rose." So that's how it started. Not with a murder or a ransom note or a knock on the head, but with a salad fork, a circle of secrets, and a man who knew how to pair white asparagus with leverage. Next stop, disruption at the brownstone. The next morning, Wolfe announced he would remain in the plant rooms until precisely 10:55, which gave me just enough time to wrangle Lionel Boone through Manhattan traffic and into a chair. Without giving Wolfe the satisfaction of seeing me rush, Boone arrived in a dove-gray overcoat, with a navy scarf tucked just loosely enough to suggest wealth and self-consciousness in equal measure. He smelled like a clean cedar closet and anxiety. I showed him into the office, sat him in the red leather chair nearest Wolfe's desk, and offered him a cup of coffee. He declined, which Wolfe would note. Everyone who declined our coffee was either too nervous to drink it or vain enough to think they didn't need the boost. I left the tray on the side table anyway, when Wolfe entered, at exactly 10:55. Boone stood instinctively, then hesitated like he wasn't sure whether he was expected to bow. Wolfe didn't acknowledge him. He moved to his chair with the measured gravity of a barge docking, settled himself, and adjusted the angle of his yellow silk handkerchief with 2 fingers. "I am Nero Wolfe," he said. "Mr. Boone, I have reviewed the summary provided by Mr. Goodwin. What I lack is the names." Boone nodded quickly and reached into his briefcase. He produced a thin folder, the kind meant to look expensive without committing to it. "These are the guest lists from our last 3 dinners," he said. "Mr. Vale attended all 3. So did the others listed here." Wolfe gestured, and I took the folder. The names were typed, neat, alphabetical. There were 14 per list, but with overlap most names recurred. And Boone had circled 6 that appeared on all 3: Redmond Vale, Clive Norridge, Marion Delafield, Charles Baird, Dr. Howard Binstock, and Lorna Newell. "Who are they?" Wolfe asked without glancing at the list. Boone hesitated. "Mr. Norridge owns a private equity firm. Ms. Delafield is a philanthropist divorced, quite sharp. Mr. Baird is a sculptor, or was. He's largely retired. Dr. Binstock is a neurologist at St. Eustace, very well known. And Ms. Newell, she writes food criticism for Platelines." I gave a small whistle. Platelines was the kind of publication that could make or break a restaurant in 500 words. If she had a sharp pen and a long memory, I could see how a lot of people might want to butter her up or serve her a dish she wouldn't forget. "And Mr. Vale?" Wolfe asked. "A trust attorney, rather discreet clientele. Do you have any reason to believe the accusation was false?" Boone looked at the floor for a moment. "I don't know. Vale's very careful, but not warm. He's disliked. That could mean anything." Wolfe's eyes half closed. "The note. What exactly did it say?" Boone's voice took on the cadence of memorization. "Are Vale falsified legal instruments to divert funds from the late Jacob Edison's estate to a shell account under his control. The widow, E. Edison, is unaware, a crime of opportunity dressed in legal robes. The Thornfield Circle should decide what company it keeps." I raised an eyebrow. A little poetic for a smear job. Wolfe nodded faintly. "Who would have known of this alleged crime if it occurred?" "No one at Thornfield, that I'm aware of, but I'm not privy to the guests' legal dealings. Still, I can't imagine anyone risking that kind of note without either truth or vengeance behind it." Wolfe's lips thinned. "You're incorrect. It might also be misdirection. Boone stiffened. To what end? That, Wolfe said, is what we must determine. You said the original note is gone. Boone nodded. Mr. Vale crumpled it and left with it. He was pale, furious, embarrassed, and no one else at the table acknowledged it. They pretended not to see. It was very tense. The dessert came out, but no one touched it. Conversation ended. Good, Wolfe said. Then the game began. I'd seen it before, his mind slipping into a lower gear, where the work was slow but steady, and nothing escaped. It was like watching a pot that never boiled because it didn't need to. Boone was still gripping the edge of his chair. Mr. Boone, Wolfe said, I will accept the engagement. My terms are standard. You will pay a retainer of $7,000. I will determine the means and pace of investigation. You will not withhold any information, especially regarding members of this circle. Boone exhaled, as if he'd been waiting to be denied. Yes, of course, that's acceptable. Very well. Mr. Goodwin will begin by interviewing the 5 others present at these dinners. Boone straightened. You'll need an introduction. No, Wolfe said. Mr. Goodwin will observe, and you will provide a list of each person's known associates, habits, and histories. I can try. Do more than try. And arrange for a lunch reservation for 2 at the Thornfield Circle. Anonymous, Mr. Goodwin and Mr. Panzer will attend. Boone blinked. It's not open for casual dining. I am aware, Wolfe said curtly. But if you wish my help, you'll arrange it. He rose. The audience was over. Boone understood, gathered his coat and folder, and left, with that same careful step, as if he were carrying a sofa in his chest. Wolfe waited until the door clicked shut. Then, without looking up, he said, Archie, yeah, we begin with Marian Delafield. She is the least likely to lie well. That's a compliment. It's a lead. He shifted in his chair, the only movement he'd made in 20 minutes. This is not about a forged will, Archie. Not entirely. That accusation, whether true or not, was crafted to wound in public. That makes it personal. Embarrassment, not justice, was the goal. I nodded. Someone at that table was settling a score. More than that, someone was sending a warning, or an invitation. An invitation, yes, and we have our SVPD. He closed his eyes. That meant he was done speaking, which meant it was time for me to call Saul, polish my shoes, and pay a visit to a food society that didn't know it was about to be dissected by a man who thought meals should never be ruined by emotion or anonymous notes. And for the record, I was not about to skip dessert. If you've never been to the Thornfield Circle, I'll spare you the Google search and just tell you this. Imagine an exclusive supper club disguised as a quiet brownstone on the Upper West Side, staffed by people who treat parsley placement like diplomatic strategy. You don't get in by calling ahead. You get in by knowing someone who thinks knowing someone should be currency. Thanks to Lionel Boone's behind-the-curtains pull and Wolfe's iron insistence, Saul Panzer and I were booked under the unremarkable aliases of Mr. Winslow and Mr. Curtis, a pair of out-of-town culinary enthusiasts with just enough money and curiosity to keep the staff respectful but not suspicious. The dining room, where our little mystery had begun, was long and narrow with old brick walls, candlelight. That gave everyone better skin, and a table built for exactly 12. Each place setting looked arranged by someone with a ruler and a mild superiority complex. Saul, wearing a suit so muted it practically apologized for having buttons, took the seat on my left. I chose the one at the far end, back to the wall. Habit. Dinner was 6 courses. We weren't there for the food, but the food wasn't about to let that stop it. First came a citrus-cured scallop with shaved fennel that nearly convinced me. Wolfe was right about raw seafood. Then a spring leek, veloute so smooth it could have been used in negotiations. Every dish came with murmured service, linen whispers, and the quiet scraping of cutlery handled by people with opinions about sauce viscosity. But Wolfe hadn't sent us for the consomme. He wanted eyes. He wanted to know how a note anonymous, accusatory, and calculated could be folded into a napkin and passed like a bad secret among people who were supposed to be above gossip and beneath notice. What struck me first was how performative it all was. Every guest knew to compliment the olive oil, pause between bites, and ask intelligent but non-revealing questions. It was dinner as theater, and everyone played their part. If the note had disrupted one of these dinners, it wasn't just shocking, it was sacrilegious. Midway through the main course, roasted duck with a tamarind glaze. That made me briefly believe in God. Saul leaned slightly toward me and murmured, 3 repeats, woman in blue, man in gray tweed, and our critic from Platelines. I nodded. Names? Lorna Newell's the critic. She didn't touch her wine. Watches everyone. Norwich is the tweed. Fake laugh, doesn't trust the butter. Delafield's in blue. Every sentence ends with a smile that doesn't reach her eyes. I let my gaze drift naturally. Delafield was mid-conversation with a man I pegged as one of those Fox academic entrepreneurs. Probably launched a spice delivery startup and gave TED Talks on cumin. But she listened like she was waiting for him to say something damning. Her smile was polished, but behind it, I saw calculation. Wolfe had said she wouldn't lie well. I was beginning to see what he meant. Her mouth did the talking, but her eyes looked like they were always waiting to hear something they could use. Lorna Newell, on the other hand, did very little talking. She took notes mentally, if not on paper, and had the kind of polite posture. That meant she was either trained in ballet or very recently furious with someone. She glanced at Saul twice and at me 3 times, the third time pausing just long enough to tell me she was suspicious. When the final course arrived, a hazelnut daiquoise so delicate it should have come with a security escort, I saw Boone slip into the room and nod once, discreetly, to the chef. He spotted me and Saul, made a quick mental check that we hadn't set anything on fire, and disappeared into the back again. As the diners lingered over espresso and dessert wine, I caught just enough snippets to piece together the posturing. Norwich bragged without seeming to, which takes practice. Delafield mentioned a benefit she was organizing, which no one believed was altruistic, and Newell made a quiet, barbed comment about people who use gastronomy to launder reputations, which earned a few nervous chuckles. Then she excused herself. I gave Saul a look. He nodded once he'd follow her. I stayed behind to make polite conversation and sip at my coffee, nodding at Clive Norwich's commentary on food and finance like I hadn't already seen through his whole act before the consomme later. Back at our own brownstone, the one with the real power, I briefed Wolfe in the office. Saul followed Newell for 3 blocks. She got into a cab. Nothing strange, but she made a phone call before she stepped in. Short, 15 seconds tops. Wolfe, who had been listening with his fingertips pressed together like he was holding in a secret, finally spoke. She's not the instigator. I raised an eyebrow. That's a fast judgment. She's careful, Wolfe said. Too careful. A note passed at that table would have been a display. She would never risk an uncontrolled reaction. Agreed, I said. But Delafield? Wolfe nodded once, slowly. Yes, she is reckless enough, but not for vengeance. For something else. He reached for a file I hadn't seen him touch since yesterday. The widow, he said. E. Edison. I asked you to check her out. You did, I said, flipping open my notebook. Elena Edison, mid-40s, runs a botanical import business. Used to partner with a now-defunct foundation funded by Surprise Marion Delafield. They had a falling out for years ago. Something about the foundation's assets being liquidated under strange circumstances. And Redmond Vale handled the foundation's dissolution paperwork. Wolfe grunted. So, 3 people, 1 broken enterprise, and a public scandal veiled as etiquette. He leaned back in his chair. Find out what Delafield lost when the foundation died, and what Vale gained. And the others, Norwich and Binstock, are accessories. Perhaps not even knowingly, but Delafield knew Vale's reputation. She set the table. The note was bait. For what? That, Wolfe said. We are about to find out. He closed his eyes, and that was my cue. The game was moving, but the pieces were still opaque. Someone had passed a note to expose a crime, but maybe not the crime we thought. Maybe it wasn't about stealing money. Maybe it was about revenge served chilled, right after the duck. Either way, the dining room was no longer just a scene. It was the battlefield. It was Friday morning, and Fritz was arranging a bouquet of marigolds with the kind of concentration most people reserved for diffusing bombs. I left him to it and brought Wolfe his coffee, Jamaican Blue Mountain, brewed to his specifications, which is to say, impossible to replicate without a stopwatch, thermometer, and an ancestral understanding of bitterness. He took it with a nod, then gestured toward the stack of notes I'd left on the corner of his desk. "They're typed and in order," I said. "Delafield's foundation called Hope Arbor was dissolved 4 years ago. The assets were supposed to be distributed to 5 small agricultural non-profits. Only 3 ever got anything." Vale drew up the documents. His fee, according to the ledgers, was $20,000. The missing 2 groups never filed a complaint. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Why not?" "According to their statements at the time," I said, flipping a page, "they declined the grant due to internal restructuring, which is a bureaucratic way of saying someone leaned on them." "Phooey," Wolfe muttered. "To untraceable losses, no protest. Convenient, more than convenient." I said, "Profitable." The foundation's leftover balance was absorbed by a shell company called R.E. Associates, incorporated in Delaware. Guess who signed the incorporation papers? He didn't guess. He didn't have to. Redmond Vale. Wolfe said, "Then the accusation in the note has merit. Looks that way." He drummed his fingers once on the arm of his chair, then reached for the orchid catalog that had been sitting neglected for 2 days. He didn't open it. Just let his hand rest there like he was reminding himself the world hadn't gone completely. "To hell, I still do not believe Delafield composed the note," he said. "Not in its language. Its cadence is not hers." "You're right," I said. "But she might have fed the intel to someone who would write it that way." Indeed. The composition was deliberate. The phrasing, a crime of opportunity. "Dressed in legal robes" is florid, too literary for a socialite, too pointed for a financier, but plausible from a journalist. Newell, Wolfe echoed and closed his eyes. "You will visit her. Do not press. Do not accuse. Ask about Vale, about Hope Arbor. Let her speak. If she had a hand in this, she will not resist showing her fingerprints." I made the call and got an appointment at Lorna Newell's apartment on 74th. She lived in a 5th-floor walk-up in a brownstone, converted into private flats, the kind of place with old moldings and fresh tension. The door had a brass knocker shaped like a pinnacle, stylish, obscure, and just pretentious enough to be her. She answered in jeans, a dark green sweater, and the kind of expression that tells you you're exactly on time and still unwelcome. "I don't usually allow interviews at home," she said as she stepped aside. "But you're not press, not officially," I said, "and I'm not here for a story." She led me into a living room that looked like a second-hand bookstore, and a Scandinavian designer had gotten into a polite argument. Shelves of cookbooks and philosophy texts, a chaise that probably had a French name, and a framed photo of a lemon tree in bloom. "You brought a notebook," she said. "I bring one everywhere," I replied. "Old habit." She sat, motioned for me to do the same. "You said you had questions." "I do. About Redmond Vale, about Hope Arbor, about what happens when money that should help people ends up propping up someone's offshore account." Her jaw didn't move, but the space around her eyes did. "You think I wrote the note?" she said. I didn't answer, just waited. I didn't, but I know who did. Now that was unexpected. I leaned forward, and he came to me first. She said, wanted me to publish it. I refused, said it was a serious allegation, unproven. He said he didn't care. He wanted the man exposed. I told him he was using my platform to wage a personal war. He said fine. He'd find another one. Who? She hesitated. Charles Baird. I blinked. The sculptor. He's not sculpting anymore. He's dying. That took the air out of the room for a second. Pancreatic, she said. 6 months, maybe less. He told me he didn't want to go quietly knowing that Vale had ruined something good and gotten rich doing it. Why Hope Arbor? He'd funded part of it, she said. Donated 6 figures in memory of his sister. She died of an autoimmune disorder. Plant-based therapies helped. Hope Arbor was supposed to continue that kind of research. Then it collapsed. He found out Vale had rerouted the money, saw the documents, wanted to burn him. Publicly, permanently. And Delafield, she knew, but she wouldn't act. Said exposure would damage her standing with other cousins, so Charles did it himself. By slipping the note into a napkin, she nodded. It was his idea of justice, discretion with just enough heat. I jotted it all down. It fit. But something still pulled at the edge of my thoughts. Why now? I asked. The foundation folded for years ago. Why light the fuse now? Newell gave me a look. Not pitying, just tired. Because when you're dying, she said, your fuse shortens. I thanked her, left, and rode the subway back in silence. At the brownstone, Wolfe was at his desk with a fresh beer and a chessboard he had no intention of playing. He confessed, I said. Baird, through Newell. Wolfe opened one eye, not surprising. He's dying. Wolfe grunted. So is Justice. Slowly, I filled him in. Wolfe listened, sipped his beer, and then murmured. We now know who planted the note, but not what it triggered. What do you mean? I mean, Wolfe said, that Charles Baird struck a match, but I suspect the flame has already moved beyond his control. He reached for the phone. Saul, he said when the line picked up, find out if Redmond Vale has altered his will in the last 30 days, and whether Charles Baird's name appears in it. A pause. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Good, he said. Report back when you confirm. He hung up and looked at me. Double quotes Archie. Baird wanted revenge, but I fear he's about to receive a different kind of legacy. I frowned. You think Vale's going to cut him in? No, Wolfe said grimly. I think someone wants to make it look like he did, and that means someone is setting the stage for something more permanent. And just like that, dessert was off the table. We were back in the game. The following morning began with 2 calls before I'd finished my eggs, one from Saul Panzer and one from Lon Cohen at the Gazette. Saul's call was short and sharp, as usual. Vale had amended his will last Tuesday. No press announcements, no legal filings just yet. But Saul had a source in the clerk's office who owed him a favor, and a slice of peach pie, and yes, Charles Baird was named in it. A bequest, substantial, 10% of Vale's estate, Saul said. No restrictions, no conditions, neat and legal, just unusual enough to raise eyebrows, and just recent enough to smell like smoke. Got it, I said. How's Baird's health? Worse than I thought. Hospice care started last week. He's not answering the phone. Hasn't left his place in days. That was the end of Saul's report. He didn't linger, and I didn't ask him to. I hung up just in time for Lon's call. You hear about Vale? He asked. I sat up straighter. I was just about to. He was found unconscious in his apartment this morning. EMTs brought him and he's at St. Eustace. No visible wounds, but it wasn't natural. Docs aren't saying poison, but they're not ruling it out either. And he's alive for now. I see you, under watch. I thanked Lon, made a mental note to send him a bottle of scotch for being the best grapevine in the business, and headed straight to the office to report. Wolfe was at his desk, buttering toast with an expression usually reserved for monastic reflection. I delivered the updates. When I got to the part about the will and Baird's name, he looked up. Predictable, he said, and yet disappointing. I knew what he meant. If Vale had been poisoned or drugged, or knocked out with something that wouldn't leave marks, then someone was doing more than settling scores. Someone was manipulating outcomes. Too late to pull back now, I said. If this turns into a murder, we'll have company. Indeed, Wolfe muttered and rang for Fritz. Breakfast, he announced, must be abbreviated. I raised an eyebrow. You're leaving the house. He shot me a look that could have curdled cream. No, but I intend to invite guests. That afternoon, invitations went out subtle. Polite summonses to everyone who'd attended the infamous Thornfield dinner. Boone arranged the logistics. Fritz arranged the seating. Wolfe arranged his thinking. By 6 o'clock, the chairs in the office were full. Lorna Newell arrived first, calm and observant, with her notebook tucked into her coat pocket like a concealed weapon. Delafield came next, dressed in dove-gray silk, hair immaculately coiled, eyes a touch too wide. Then Norridge, offering clipped apologies and stale pleasantries. Dr. Binstock, who looked like he'd just finished a 16-hour shift and didn't trust anyone who didn't wear gloves. And finally Boone, who seemed deeply aware that this was all happening under his brand's umbrella, and that if anything else went wrong, Thornfield's next event would be a liquidation sale. They all sat. Wolfe, as usual, did not rise. He remained in his chair, eyes half-lidded. watching the room like a man observing a slow leak in a valuable ceiling. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I thank you for your attendance. I assure you this is not a courtesy. It is a necessity." No one spoke. Even Norwich, who looked like he was about to object on principle, closed his mouth. "You are here because of what occurred 3 nights ago," Wolfe continued. "A note was introduced into your company, anonymous, accusatory, and timed. It accused Mr. Redmond Vale of legal malfeasance. That was not gossip. It was an act, a calculated move designed not merely to embarrass, but to provoke." Delafield stirred. Newell's pen made a quiet scratch in her notebook. "The accusation, I regret to inform you, had merit. Mr. Vale did indeed reroute the funds intended for the charities supported by Hope Arbor. He profited, others lost." Norwich's brow furrowed. "How do you know that?" "I do not guess, sir," Wolfe said flatly. "The documents exist, as do the beneficiaries of the deception." There was a silence. Wolfe allowed it to settle like dust on lacquered wood. "The note," he said, "was composed by Charles Baird. Gasps soft ones, refined and restrained. But there." Delafield's hand fluttered to her necklace. Newell didn't react. "He confessed?" Delafield asked. "To Ms. Newell," Wolfe replied, who, to her credit, declined to become a vessel for his revenge. "He wrote the note himself, placed it in the napkin during the dinner. Mr. Vale read it, was rattled, left. Then that's the end of it," Binstock said gruffly. "A dying man made a point." "No," Wolfe said sharply, "that was only the beginning." Now they were truly listening. "This morning, Mr. Vale was found unconscious in his home. He is now in critical care. Poisoning is suspected." Another murmur. Boone stood, visibly shaken. No one told me." "You were not told," Wolfe interrupted, "because the facts are still developing. But I will tell you this, the poison, if it was poison, did not enter his system without forethought." Delafield stood, her voice breaking through the tension like a cracked wineglass. "Are you suggesting one of us?" "I suggest nothing," Wolfe said. "I know that someone saw in Baird's action an opportunity, a way to remove a man under the guise of righteous exposure." I stepped forward now, holding the copy of Vale's amended will, 10% of Vale's estate. I said, "Bequeathed to Baird, drawn up last week, legally binding, conveniently timed." "But Baird didn't know," Newell said. "He didn't expect that. He didn't ask for it." "Precisely," Wolfe said, "which makes it the perfect cover. Who would suspect a man dying of cancer, who already made his statement, who stood to gain nothing?" He let that sink in. "Someone else," Wolfe said quietly, "slipped into the space Baird opened. Someone who wanted Vale gone and wanted the blame to point elsewhere. A beat. Marion Delafield." Every head turned. She froze. "That's absurd." She whispered. "You benefited most," Wolfe said. "Hope Arbor's fall stained your record. Vale's exposure without legal charges would still leave him a threat. But dead men sign no more papers, and conveniently, the will included Baird. A distraction, an excuse. I didn't know about the will," she said. "No," Wolfe agreed. "But you knew about Baird's plan, and you knew what hospital Vale used. Your name is still listed as his medical proxy, a holdover from a brief partnership, which means you could have walked into his apartment yesterday, under any pretense, and dropped a capsule into his tea." She rose, slowly. "I want a lawyer," she said. "You will have one," Wolfe said. "Mr. Goodwin?" I stepped forward and opened the office door. Inspector Kramer was already waiting. Wolfe had called him 20 minutes earlier. Delafield turned pale. Boone sat down hard. The others stayed frozen. Wolfe sighed. "This," he said, "is why I detest dining with strangers." And with that, dinner was truly over. The dust had barely settled from Marion Delafield's quiet arrest when Wolfe demanded solitude, though in his case, solitude meant a closed door, complete silence, and 12 square feet of orchids to keep him company. I let him retreat and escorted the remaining guests, Newell, Norwich, Binstock, and a visibly shaken Boone out the front door like I was sweeping up. After a particularly awkward dinner party, no one said much. Norwich tried a feeble protest about reputations, and Newell told him gently, but with surgical precision, to consider what a reputation meant. If it relied on silence about a man's death, I liked her a little better after that. Once the last coat was claimed and the final murmured apologies made, I locked the door and returned to the office. The place still held the echo of confrontation, like the smell of cigar smoke hours after it's gone. I poured myself a splash of brandy and sat. I knew Wolfe wouldn't emerge for another hour, at least maybe two. If the orchids were particularly conversational today, that left me with time to do what I usually do when a case resolves but leaves its fingerprints on the drapes, dig, because the thing was, something didn't sit right. The sequence made sense. Baird writes the note. Delafield sees an opportunity. Vale ends up in the ICU, poisoned by a woman with access and motive. Case closed with a neat moral bow tied at the neck. But the neatness, it was too tight, and Wolfe doesn't like bows. He likes knots, complex ones. And while he'd identified Delafield's ambition and the perfect storm of circumstance, I had the nagging sense we were missing something. Not the culprit, necessarily, but the spark. The part of the match that ignites before the flame catches. I spent the next 40 minutes reviewing notes, the statements from Newell, the timeline of Baird's diagnosis, Vale's will. Saul's report mentioned a witness, someone who'd seen a visitor leave Vale's apartment late the previous evening, just before he collapsed. The description matched Delafield, mostly, but one detail stuck out. The neighbor reported hearing raised voices, two of them, a man's and a woman's, that hadn't made Wolfe's final recital. Maybe it hadn't registered. Maybe he'd deemed it irrelevant. But I didn't. I picked up the phone and called Saul. Goodwin. I'm listening. Saul said. No hello necessary. Revisit Vale's building. Quietly. Check the guest log. And see if any visitors were logged the night before he was found. A pause. I already did. That took me aback. And one visitor, around 8:45 p.m. Charles Baird. I sat up. You're kidding. Nope. Signed under his own name. Concierge said he looked unwell. Said he was there for a short meeting with Mr. Vale. 15 minutes. Left shaky. Didn't return. Why didn't you tell me? I assumed Wolfe already knew. I called it in 2 hours ago. Which meant Wolfe had known and hadn't said a word. That meant he was still playing. I hung up and paced the office. So Baird had seen Vale. The man dying of cancer, furious about his foundation's collapse, had gone to speak to the man he'd accused publicly, anonymously, and a day later, that man was poisoned. Wolfe had built a clean narrative with Delafield at the center. But if Baird had walked in angry and walked out shaky, we had to consider something darker. Something the dying man hadn't just written. Had Baird gone to confront him, to threaten, or to beg? And then I remembered something else. Newell had said Baird didn't know about the inheritance. But Wolfe had said the amended will named Baird. What if that meeting between Vale and Baird was about exactly that? What if Vale had told him? I rang Wolfe's line. No answer. I tried again, twice. On the fourth try, he picked up with a grunt. Yes, you knew Baird visited Vale. I did. Why didn't you mention it? Because it was not yet time. Then make it time. Because if Baird knew he was being written into that will and he still dropped that note, then this wasn't about justice. It was about control. Double quotes, silence. Then Wolfe said, come up. That was rare enough that I didn't argue. I climbed the stairs and entered the plant room. The air was humid, sweet, and smelled like loam and stubbornness. Wolfe sat in his chair between the orchids, one hand resting on the armrest, the other holding a volume of Horace he clearly wasn't reading. I believe, he said without looking at me, that Charles Baird did not expect to be named in the will. He visited Vale. They argued. Yes, Wolfe said, because Vale told him, and Baird was not grateful. That clicked. He didn't want the money, I said slowly. He didn't want a reward. He wanted Vale exposed. Precisely. Vale thought he could shut Baird up by tossing him a legacy, a final act of appeasement. But Baird saw it for what it was, a bribe. He was enraged. I nodded. So Baird leaves, but now he knows if Vale dies soon, Baird gets a slice of his estate. Wolfe finally looked at me, and Baird, Archie Baird, is dying anyway. He has nothing to lose, and now he has something to leave behind. It hit me like a late train. You think Baird poisoned him? I do. Delafield had motive. but no longer the urgency. She was content with public shame, but Baird he had the pain, the proximity, and the clean hands of a man who expected no investigation. He knew he'd die first. Yes, Wolfe said softly, and so he believed his justice would survive him, unquestioned. We sat in the humid silence. Even the orchids seemed to hold their breath. Then Wolfe sighed. I misjudged the man, he said. I thought him theatrical, not ruthless. What now? He looked at me. Now we wait. Mr. Vale may recover. If he does, he may yet confirm it. If not, we are left with inference, and no living suspect. He closed the book. Either way, the case is over. Justice was done, if not by law. And perhaps that is the tragedy of it. He stood, slowly, for Wolfe. That was equivalent to a cavalry charge. I will be down for dinner. Tell Fritz to serve something cold. He passed me, paused, and added, and Archie, no brandy tonight. It dulls the sense of consequence. Then he left the orchids to their silence, and I stayed behind, trying to decide which kind of justice we just witnessed. The kind you survive or the kind that survives you. By Monday, the weather had turned mean gray skies, drizzle sharp as needles. The kind of day that makes a man suspicious of everything, including his umbrella. I sat in the office, watching the rain roll down the glass like it was auditioning for a Neuer film, while Wolfe stayed planted in his chair, arms crossed over a volume of Boswell's Life of Johnson. He hadn't turned a page in for 15 minutes. Vale was still alive, just barely. The last update from Saul said he'd regained consciousness for a few minutes, mumbled a few words, then slipped back under. No confirmation, no confession, no convenient epilogue. But the real development came from Charles Baird, or rather, from the envelope his nurse hand-delivered that morning. The nurse, a tall, competent woman with shoes that didn't squeak and eyes that didn't flinch, arrived at 10:04 a.m., asked for me, and handed me a slim, cream-colored envelope with my name on it in spidery handwriting. He said you'd understand, she said, then left with the kind of finality that told me she didn't answer follow-up questions. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of thick stationery, and on it, Baird had written a short, tightly wound letter in blue ink. His hand was shaky, but deliberate. He didn't waste words. Goodwin, by the time you read this, I will likely be gone. I do not regret writing the note. I regret waiting so long to act. I confronted Mr. Vale. He offered me a portion of his estate. I rejected it, told him what I thought of his generosity. I wanted the truth exposed, not a favor. I left his apartment alive. He was well. If something happened after that, it was not by my hand. I am many things, but I am not a murderer. I wanted justice, not blood. You may believe me or not. That's your job. But for what it's worth, if he dies, I hope it isn't in peace. CBI read it twice, then a third time, before handing it silently to Wolfe. He read it once, then dropped it on his desk and leaned back. So, he said. So, I echoed. He says he didn't do it. He would. But Wolfe tapped his index finger against the armrest. He had reason to lie. He also had reason not to. He was dying, which lends truth to his tone. The anger feels earned, not staged. And yet, I said, Vale's still poisoned. Yes, Wolfe said. But Baird's role may have been more symbolic than active. I didn't answer. I was thinking about the timing again, how Baird left, and someone else entered the picture. Maybe someone who knew about the visit, knew about the will, and decided to finish what Baird started, or thought they were helping him complete the arc. Someone tried to frame Baird, I said. Wolfe didn't nod, but he didn't contradict me either. And the will made him the perfect fall guy, yes. A dying man seeking justice is believable. A dying man enacting revenge is inevitable. It was too easy. We sat in silence, and I could feel the line tightening again, one final knot forming at the center. I made a call to Lon Cohen. Anything new on Vale? Not yet, Lon said. But the buzz is building. The firm's pretending he's on a medical leave. But his clients are panicking. And guess what? One of them is suing already. Claims Vale altered their trust last month without consent. Interesting. Want me to dig? Just the facts, Lon. No seasoning. I hung up and turned to Wolfe. Who benefits most if Vale dies not morally, but financially? Wolfe's eyelids dropped halfway. That is not my department, yours, already on it. I spent the next 3 hours chasing financial threads. Boone came through with Vale's last 5 clients, and with some persuasion and the promise of not naming him in any of this, he let me access a partial client registry. I cross-referenced that with public records, property transfers, and trust documents. And there she was, Lorna Newell, not as a client, but as someone named as a contingent beneficiary in one of Vale's managed estates, a trust fund created by an old flame someone Newell had written about once years ago. A man who died last spring. The money had been tied up, waiting to pass through a legal filter. Vale was the executor. And if Vale died before the challenge was resolved, the trust defaulted. The funds passed without objection. To her, I returned to the office just as Fritz was setting out a tray with lemon water and butter crackers. Wolfe glanced at the clock. You're early. I have a name, I said, and a motive. That got his full attention. Lorna Newell. She knew about the amended will. She knew about Baird's note. She knew how to control a narrative hell. She lives in narratives. I tossed the file on the desk. She's the contingent beneficiary of the Lester Keywell Trust. Vale was the executor. If he'd stayed alive, the trust would have been contested. Keywell's family wanted it reversed. But Vale gone, the payout flows freely. And no one suspects her, Wolfe said quietly. She had access, opportunity, and she already knew Baird's note would soften the target. Wolfe finished. We stared at each other. She poisoned him, I said. Not to make a point. To get paid. Wolfe let out a breath, not quite a sigh. Call Kramer, he said. We'll hold one more gathering. This time, the room felt sharper, smaller, just Wolfe, me, Boone, and Lorna Newell. She wore a different shade of green and the same calm smile. But this time, her fingers tapped her notebook ever so faintly. Miss Newell, Wolfe said. You were clever. You let Mr. Baird light the match. You watched him draw all the fire. I beg your pardon, no, you don't, Wolfe interrupted. You poisoned Mr. Vale not because you feared exposure, but because you wanted silence and money. She stared at him, no movement, no denial. I stepped forward and dropped the file on the desk. This is your connection to Lester Keywell. Still, she said nothing. Wolfe leaned in ever so slightly. You used a story to hide a theft. You are not the first, but you are among the more audacious. Then, finally, she spoke. Do you have proof? No, Wolfe said. But I have Mr. Vale. He regained consciousness an hour ago, and he has already confirmed you were in his apartment. You brought him tea, chamomile. That was it. Her face didn't fall. It collapsed. Kramer entered right on cue. She didn't resist. Later, Wolfe sat down to dinner. Pheasant, morals. Something about a tarragon glaze. I poured the beer, and we ate in silence for 10 minutes before Wolfe spoke. To people sought justice, Archie. Only one disguised it as murder. I nodded. Baird lit the match. She burned the house down. And what have we learned? I grinned. That dessert is safest when served with no witnesses. He grunted. I refilled his glass. Outside, the rain stopped. Inside, the house was quiet again. By Tuesday morning, the brownstone had settled back into its natural state, quiet, orderly, and vaguely hostile to the idea of company. Fritz was back to experimenting with a trout Terran that Wolfe hadn't requested, but would almost certainly approve. And Wolfe himself was in the plant rooms performing his usual chlorophyll ritual. I was at my desk in the office, sorting through a stack of paper that had the combined density of a city ordinance and the appeal of damp toast. The case, as Wolfe put it after last night's pheasant, was concluded with more symmetry than satisfaction, which was his way of saying it wrapped up neatly enough, but it left a taste he didn't like. I got it. Baird was dead. Vale would survive, but his career wouldn't. The money would go where it wasn't meant to, and Lorna Newell, who had chosen greed over legacy, was now learning firsthand how polite the city jail isn't. Boone's precious Thornfield Circle, after all its curated dignity, had been exposed as a feeding ground for quiet crimes and louder appetites. Still, we had clarity. If not justice, then at least accuracy. Round 10. Wolfe emerged from upstairs and took his chair with all the grace of a battleship returning to port. I handed him a sheet with the latest from Kramer. Newell had confessed, more or less. She claimed it wasn't murder, just a calculated safeguard. Her exact words, which sounded more like stockbroker language than anything criminal, and yet here we were. She's already hired counsel, I said. The sort who wears white shirts that cost more than my rent, and speaks in Latin even when ordering a sandwich. Wolfe grunted. Phooey. She will not succeed. Not even an obfuscation. The crime was too deliberate. I leaned back in my chair. Still, I keep thinking about Baird, the way he handled it. He thought he was playing chess, but he was actually just carving the board. He knew, Wolfe said softly. That is the tragedy of it. He knew how thin the line was between exposure and manipulation. He tried to use his truth as a weapon, but truth, like fire, doesn't distinguish between wood and paper. I let that hang for a second. Wolfe wasn't usually in the mood for metaphor unless it came from a Roman philosopher or a Burgundy vintage. He wrote me a letter, I said finally. Wolfe glanced up. Before he died. I went on. Said he didn't poison Vale. Said he wanted justice, not blood. And do you believe him? I thought about that. About the weight of the letter, the shakiness in his script, the rage tucked inside the restraint. Yeah, I said. I do. Wolfe closed his eyes, leaned back. Then let us say he struck the match and walked away. It was Miss Newell who returned with a can of kerosene and called it housekeeping. I smiled at that. That's one for the record. There was a knock at the door. Fritz poked his head in. Immaculate as ever, lunch at 1, gentlemen. He said, a light sofal and tomato consomme. And a wine I believe will suit Mr. Wolfe's current temperament. Wolfe opened one eye. You presume too much, Fritz. Fritz raised a brow. Then I presume correctly. Wolfe grunted his closest approximation of amusement and waved him off. After Fritz disappeared, I tapped the final notes into the case folder. No more suspects. No more statements. No more polite dinners turned into depositions. Boone had called earlier that morning to inform us that Thornfield would pause operations indefinitely. He sounded exhausted, not angry, not indignant, just hollow, like the thing he'd built had shown its seams, and all the polish in the world couldn't glue them back together. Wolfe dictated a short note to him, formal, eloquent, and just sharp enough to be read twice. I regret that your establishment, which devoted itself so fiercely to the ideal of refined taste, proved so vulnerable to moral rot. Wolfe said aloud as I typed, may your next venture begin with fewer secrets and fewer linen napkins. I'll send it by courier. I said, snail mail seems forgiving. Wolfe nodded, and have Saul invoice the time, with the surcharge for being dragged into a dining room under false pretenses, for being denied dessert. Wolfe said flatly, twice. I laughed, then paused. You think she would have done it if Baird hadn't written that note? No. Wolfe said, she lacked the nerve for initiative, but she had appetite, and like so many others, she mistook someone else's conviction for permission. That's poetic. It's also true. A few minutes passed. Wolfe picked up a book. I picked up the phone and canceled a dentist appointment I hadn't planned to keep anyway. The world moved on, as it does. And then Wolfe spoke again. This case, he said without looking up, was not about death. It was about appetite. The kind that hides behind manners. You see it often, Archie, but rarely so dressed up. I'll give it a name, I said. Justice in a tuxedo, wearing gloves but no fingerprints. He nodded once. I stood. I'm going to walk to 35th and grab that peach pie Saul likes. He earned it. Wolfe grunted approval. As I reached the front door, I looked back. You think Boone will try again? I asked. Wolfe didn't glance up. Boone will open another club, he said. He'll call it something noble, and it will attract the same people, because appetite does not retreat, it relocates. Then he returned to his book. I stepped outside. The sun had returned, pale and tentative, but real. The street was still wet, the city still humming, and me, I was just a guy in a suit, heading for pie, grateful just this once that the truth had held its shape long enough for the guilty to get caught. Even if, in this town, the linen always gets laundered. The peach pie was a hit. Saul Panzer didn't. Say much he never does, but when I handed over the box, he raised an eyebrow, cut a clean slice, and ate it with the quiet, focused satisfaction of a man who believes in getting to the heart of things without decoration. He offered me a sliver, which I declined in favor of my own slice from Fritz later. I'm no fool. On the walk back to the brownstone, I played the case over again in my head, as I tend to do when the smoke's cleared, but the room still smells like fire. It wasn't just that Newell had poisoned Vale, it was how she'd done it, how carefully she'd waited for someone else to create the context, how she'd slid her ambition right into the cracks of someone else's grief, and how, in the end, Wolfe had figured her out without leaving his chair. I returned to find Wolfe in the office, at his desk, reading a culinary monograph on rare Mediterranean mushrooms that probably hadn't been opened since the Eisenhower administration. He didn't look up when I came in, but he did ask, did Mr. Panzer enjoy his reward? Almost smiled. I said, which, for Saul, is dangerously close to euphoria. Wolfe allowed himself the faintest of nods, then turned a page. You're not done thinking about it? I said. No, he admitted. Are you? I dropped into the red chair, the one that's worn just enough to remember the weight of long cases. It's tidy, I said. Too tidy. We found the poison. We found the motive. We have a confession. And yet, Wolfe repeated. You hesitate. Something doesn't quite stick. I keep thinking about Baird. The note, the inheritance, Newell's opportunity. All of it lines up, but it still feels like everyone was reacting. Even Newell, even Delafield. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. You suspect a third hand. I don't know. I said, maybe not someone who committed the crime, but someone who nudged it, shaped the board, whispered into the right ears. Speculation. Wolfe warned, but not baseless. I said, you remember Norwich, the financier with the laugh of a donkey. He benefited too, quietly. 2 of Vale's clients switched to his firm after the scandal broke. High-value portfolios, low visibility. I double-checked this morning. Wolfe didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was even. That is opportunism, not complicity. Sure, I said. But what if he gave Newell the poison? What if he saw Baird's anger and nudged her into turning it into action? Let her take the risk. Let her burn. He walks away with the dividends. Wolfe tapped the corner of his book with one blunt finger. There is no proof. Not yet. I admitted. But the concierge at Vale's building remembered a second visitor that night, after Baird. Before Vale collapsed, a man in a brown coat and gloves. He didn't sign in. Wolfe sat up, slowly. And you believe it was Norwich? I believe. It wasn't Baird. And I believe Newell wouldn't have risked entering alone unless someone gave her cover. Wolfe exhaled through his nose. You think we stopped too early? I think we followed the trail to the fire, I said, but not to the matchbook. He closed the book gently. I cannot prove intent, he said, nor can I charge motive. But if Norwich enabled this curated, then his crime is moral, not criminal. And yet, I said, we've chased people for less. He paused, then picked up the phone. Mr. Boone, he said after a moment, you will summon Mr. Norwich to the brownstone. Say it concerns the postmortem arrangements of the circle. Use that phrase. He hung up. That won't make him nervous. I asked. No, Wolfe said. He is incapable of fear, but he is susceptible to vanity. At 4:07 p.m., Clive Norwich arrived. Same gray tweed suit, same sour smile, same sense that the room was a boardroom, and he was waiting for the floor to be his. You asked for me, he said, taking the chair without invitation. I did, Wolfe replied. Mr. Boone will not be present. This is not a meeting of the circle. It is an audit. Norwich blinked. An audit. You profited, Wolfe said calmly, directly and discreetly. To clients previously tied to Vale transferred their accounts to your firm last Friday. That's hardly illegal, Norwich said smoothly. No. Wolfe agreed. But your timing was immaculate. Too immaculate. You predicted Vale's collapse. You saw it coming. I'm a financial strategist. Norwich replied. Seeing patterns is my business. And orchestrating them, Wolfe asked. Is that also your business? Norwich didn't flinch. If you're accusing me, I am not, Wolfe said. I am inviting you to consider silence. If you continue to benefit from the destruction of others, you may someday find the tables turned. Norwich stood. Is that a threat? "It is a forecast," Wolfe said. "And I am rarely wrong about the weather." The door closed behind Norwich a moment later. I looked at Wolfe. "You're letting him go." "I have no legal hook," Wolfe said, "and no taste for empty accusations. But I wanted him to see the ceiling." "What ceiling?" "The one above his ambition, marked, cracked, and slowly lowering." That night, dinner was baked sea bass and wild rice with orange zest. No guests, no interruptions. Wolfe ate with deliberate calm, as if restoring the sanctity of his dining room one bite at a time. I joined him, grateful for the quiet, until Fritz served the dessert pear tart, delicate and golden. Wolfe took a forkful, then said, "This began with a napkin. It ended with a ledger, and in between," I said. "A whole menu of motives," he grunted. "What have we learned? That people will kill for money, but they'll manipulate for the illusion of power." Wolfe raised his glass to appetite. He said, and we ate. The next morning, I awoke to rain again, steady, unambitious rain that tapped on the windows without urgency, as if even the weather had decided it was time to wind things down. The case was over. Our players had exited, left stage right, or been dragged off by the collar. But the echoes still moved through the brownstone in small ways. A look Wolfe gave to his newspaper, the quiet way Fritz polished a tray, the lingering scent of orchids and deliberation in the office. I brewed the coffee, Wolfe's special blend, timed to the second. By the time I carried the tray in, he was seated at his desk, his fingers steepled, and his eyes focused not on a book or a report, but nothing at all. That was always the sign. He was thinking backward, not forward, reflecting. "Mail," I said, setting the tray down. "One invitation to a culinary symposium in Toronto, which I'm guessing you'll ignore. A thick envelope from a legal firm you probably don't care about. And a letter from Charles Baird's estate." Wolfe turned slightly. "The estate?" "Executor sent a copy of Baird's private will," I said, flipping the seal. "Unrelated. To Vale's bequest, dated 2 weeks before his death." I scanned it. He left a note, handwritten. "For you." Wolfe held out a hand. I passed the single sheet over. Thick bond paper, neat blue ink. Familiar shaky script. "Mer, Wolfe, I doubt I have to explain why I admired your reputation. If anyone could trace the crime I wanted exposed, it was you. I did not write the note for fame or revenge. I wrote it because I believed in consequence and feared I would die before seeing any. I suppose in the end I did both. I regret that. The truth hurt others, but I do not regret forcing it into the light. I thank you for ensuring it did not stay buried. If ever there is a garden in the next world, I hope its roses are tended with the same precision you bring to orchids." C.B. Wolfe read it once, folded it slowly, and set it down beside his beer glass with the delicacy of a man placing a knife on a silver tray. I didn't speak. We sat in the silence for a while. Then Wolfe murmured, he was mistaken. "About you? About gardens?" I raised an eyebrow. "You think there are none in the afterlife?" "I think," Wolfe said slowly, "that justice is not a garden. It is not symmetrical. It does not bloom. It merely survives, like a weed." He stood slowly, crossed to the window, watched the rain for a full minute. "Newell will plead," he said. "Her lawyers will ensure she does not see the full measure of her crime. Norwich will prosper, and Vale, if he survives, will blame everyone but himself. And Boone will host again," Wolfe said. "Or write a memoir." I nodded. "You sound like a man who hasn't changed his opinion of humanity." "I never held one," Wolfe said. "Only expectations, which continue, depressingly, to be met." There was another pause. Then he turned from the window. "But the orchids will bloom." I almost smiled. "So there's that." At noon, Fritz served a meal that felt more like a quiet apology than a celebration. Cream of celeriac soup, roast quail with glazed onions, and a clafoutis so delicate it might have floated off the plate if I hadn't pinned it with a fork. Wolfe ate steadily, with no interruptions, no deductions, no commentary. It was the first time in days that silence felt like peace, not pressure. After lunch, Wolfe retired to the plant room. I stayed in the office, filing the case into the locked drawer marked closed. That cabinet was heavy with stories, betrayals, reversals, red herrings, truths. This one would fit nicely between the window box, extortion, and the cattle and soup affair. If you're the sort who keeps score. Before I slid it in, I clipped Baird's letter to the back. A reminder, not of guilt, not of murder, but of the quiet kind of justice, the kind that doesn't land in headlines or courtroom transcripts. The kind Wolfe prefers, complete, silent, and morally pointed. Round 3, Saul Panzer dropped by. He didn't stay. Just delivered a brief message from one of his contacts. Newell's arraignment had been scheduled. Bail denied. Her lawyer looked pale. She didn't think it through, Saul said. Only as far as the dollar signs. Most people don't, I said. But she was smart. That made her dangerous. Saul nodded, then left, leaving a faint smell of wet wool and competence in his wake. I returned to the office, poured myself a splash of Fritz's elderflower cordial, and sat back in my chair, outside. The rain had turned to mist. Pedestrians blurred past like sketches, anonymous and harmless. I didn't need excitement, not that day, and I had the distinct feeling. Wolfe didn't either. Round 6, he returned from the plant room, his fingers stained green from pruning and rearranging. He sank into his chair and looked at me as if measuring the level of disorder in the world. By the number of notepads on my desk. It is over, Archie, he said. I know. You are still thinking. Always. He sighed. Was there something we missed? No, I said. But that's the part that bothers me. He smiled faintly. Then you are learning. We sat in silence until Fritz announced dinner. Chicken Ela King, biscuits, a glass of Gewürztraminer. Wolfe grunted in approval. At the table, he asked if you had to choose one word to describe this affair. I thought for a moment. Appetite. He considered. Apt. Yours or theirs, everyone's. And with that, he resumed eating. At 9 o'clock, I logged the last entry into the case ledger. At 9:02, Wolfe retired upstairs with a volume of Tacitus and 2 fingers of schnapps. At 9:04, I locked the front door, checked the windows, and turned off the lights. And at 9:10, I sat in the dark office, listening to the ticking of the old brass clock and wondering not for the first time how many crimes start not with anger or greed, but simple, gnawing hunger. Maybe that's why Wolfe insists on eating well. Maybe that's why we keep our table set. Just in case. The next evening brought a letter, not electronic, not couriered, but hand-delivered in the kind of cream-colored envelope that suggested gravitas and regret. I opened it while Wolfe sat in his chair thumbing through Plutarch's Lives, with the slow attention of someone pretending not to listen. The letter was from Lionel Boone. Mr. Wolfe, the Thornfield Circle has formally dissolved. There will be no reorganization, no press statement, and no commemorative menu. The name will disappear quietly, as it should. I regret involving you in this, though I suspect you will say it was inevitable, whether I called or not. Regardless, your intervention prevented something worse. A lie left to rot is worse than an exposed wound. For what it's worth, I've taken a position managing culinary programs for a non-profit. No secrets, no luxury, just food and people who need it. I hope that sits better with your sensibilities. Yours, L. Boone handed it to Wolfe without comment. He read it in silence, then placed it on the corner of his desk, perfectly aligned with the blotter's edge. That was inevitable, he said at last. You said that about the letter and the soup, I pointed out. I'm rarely wrong about either. I leaned back in my chair, arms folded. So that's it. Circle's gone. Vale's awake, facing disbarment and probably several lawsuits. Baird's memory is cleaner than it might have been. And Newell's going to stand trial for attempted murder with enough evidence to keep a jury nodding for days. And yet, Wolfe said, no celebration, not your style, no. But you expect a kind of narrative satisfaction wouldn't hurt. Wolfe reached for his beer and sipped. Justice, Archie, is rarely symmetrical. If it arrives, it does so limping, late, and often misidentified as something else. Like what? Consequence, or coincidence, or, in this case, appetite given structure. I smirked. That's poetic. Not poetic, he said. Factual. I stood, paced a bit. Something still needed saying, and I wasn't sure what. You ever think Baird knew what Newell might do? I asked. Wolfe's gaze flicked up. I believe he suspected, he said. He was not naive, but he was dying, and when a man nears the end, He no longer plays the same rules. He left the door open. Yes, Wolfe said. And Newell walked through it carrying poison, which means he was still partly responsible. No, Wolfe said sharply. He was guilty of faith. She was guilty of crime. That was that. I poured myself a small brandy and didn't offer him any. Wolfe only drinks when the bitter outweighs the sweet. He stared at the orchids for a long time. Archie, he said. Finally, this began with the disruption of a meal, a table set for illusion. I nodded, and ended. He continued with illusion broken, appetite weaponized, reputation bartered, truth distorted. But exposed, I added. Yes, eventually, through diligence and digestion. He gestured for the envelope again. I handed it to him. He placed it into the lower left drawer of his desk and closed it with the same finality you'd use to end a chapter. Tomorrow, he said, we resume order, the routine, the schedule. No more mystery for now. I lifted my glass to peace and quiet. He lifted his beer to fewer guests. The clock chimed the hour. The brownstone settled again. The world outside went on, unaware that a war had been fought with forks and silence and ambition behind the trappings of civility. And Wolfe, Nero Wolfe, the immovable mind in the big chair, sat still as ever, his appetite intact, his order restored, his orchids safe again. Some people fight crime with bullets. Wolfe uses dinner.